There is one alternative, one advertised alternative to contacting the private drafting organization to see the text of these standards. Agencies are legally required to supply a copy of every standard they have incorporated by reference to the Office of the Federal Register. And then according to regulations, the Office of the Federal Register is supposed to make that available for, quote, public inspection, unquote. And once in a while, you see references to the Office of the Federal Register maintaining a reading room. I had a free afternoon in Washington, D.C. back in June of 2017. I go to Washington not infrequently, but I rarely have a free afternoon before, actually during business hours. So I decided to try to find the Office of the Federal Register reading room to see exactly what incorporated by reference documents they might have. So I went to the address on the website, and it turned out that the Office of the Federal Register was no longer located there. It had moved a few blocks away. I made my way to that building, went to the security area and was told that I could not go upstairs. I called the Office of the Federal Register, where the receptionist told me that there was no such thing as a reading room. When I explained that I was interested in viewing incorporated by reference standards, she connected me to the legal director of the Office of the Federal Register, who was certainly perfectly pleasant at a personal level. She told me that because the office had just moved, all of their incorporated by reference standards that they might ordinarily have given me access to were in boxes and would not be unpacked at least until August of 2017, but I was welcome to come back after that. She also commented, and this I had not been aware of, that if a standard had been incorporated by reference into a regulation that was more than 5 years old, so 2012 or earlier, that they did not actually keep it on site in Washington, D.C. Instead, it went to long-term archives in Suitland, Maryland, and I needed to send in a request at least one day, probably several days in advance, if I wanted to see any regulation on file there. So I got no opportunity to look at any incorporated by reference standards that day. She invited me to come back in December when I will next have another trip to Washington. The last question I asked her was whether they had any list of the incorporated by standards, incorporated by reference standards that they kept on file, and she said, unfortunately, they did not. When I returned to my office, I took a moment to try to estimate how many standards they were likely to have on file by looking at how many of our federal regulations that had used incorporated standards had actually been issued in the last 5 years. My estimate is that roughly 5/6 of the incorporated by reference standards that are in federal rules are probably off-site in boxes in Suitland, Maryland. So the point here is, for the person who cannot afford to see a standard because they can't afford to pay the charge from the private organization, asking to see the standard at the Office of the Federal Register is just not a viable option. It requires physical travel to Washington, D.C., a lot of advanced planning, and when you get there, you may not even get to see a standard at all.